All right, welcome to part 3. We're going to finish up the slide on the Carolinas. So I had mentioned that the men there were hoping it would be like a rich man society, but instead we had these Indian slave wars. And so the Indian slave wars happened because these gentlemen made trading alliances with local native groups. And when they saw the local native groups had war captives, they asked if they could purchase them. Sort of how the slave trade, got started in Africa. And so they started purchasing war prisoners of native groups. The native groups, seeing that this was lucrative, went out and started capturing more people. And so back and forth between these different native groups, they just started going on raids and capturing people and selling them to the white men in the Carolinas. And eventually some of the groups down in Florida came up and started capturing some of the colonists. The colonists asked for help from their trading partners, and they didn't want to help. So basically, they learned their lesson a little bit that they couldn't continue doing this purchasing program that they were doing. So that sort of ended those trading for captives program that they had. 1729 is when they finally had a royal government that was established in the Carolinas. And things started getting a little bit better. They had better representation, and it did never turn out into being some sort of rich man's utopia. Of course, it sort of did when you consider the institution of slavery that took hold eventually. All right, in Georgia. Georgia was founded in 1732, and the main reason for the founding of Georgia was so that those folks in Carolinas could have protection from the native population and Spain in Florida. And so they recruited poor white Protestants who would do work, and they basically paid them to live there. So they gave them 50 acres, some tools, a year of supplies. They set some rules in place. They said, you guys can't be drinking, you cannot have slavery where you're living, which is interesting, no slavery in Georgia. And because people were so upset with those rules, many of them moved to South Carolina. Many of them didn't follow the rules, and eventually those provisions were taken away within 20 years, the no drinking, no slavery rules. Okay, moving right along, New England. So this is going to be the Massachusetts area, which was not ideal climate-wise. So it was very cold, it was rocky, hard to grow crops there. 1620 is when the Puritans landed at Massachusetts. Their plan had been to land in Virginia. They got off track, and they landed in New England. So this Mayflower Compact that you may have heard of before was actually an illegal document. So they did not have permission to set up a government or anything of the sort in that area. They drew that up on board the ship. Also taking place on board the ship was a mutiny. Several people also got disease. It was a very chaotic journey that they had on their way over. So one other mistake, other than landing in the wrong spot, was that they did not bring enough food. And they had a shipment that was supposed to be bringing them more supplies very shortly after they landed, but that shipment arrived in Virginia, where they were trying to land. So the folks in New England did eventually receive help from the native people. The native people in that area were the Wampanoags, and these people had been devastated by disease earlier, and they lost about 90% of their population. So they were quite eager for more people to come in to help them, to help them have an alliance, have protection from other groups, and so they did feed them until the Puritans were able to start growing their own crops. So the spring of 1621, when the Puritans finally had some crops growing, they invited them over for a thank you dinner. It's probably what you know as Thanksgiving, which you could argue has been blown out of proportion. So different cities that popped up. Salem, 1629, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. 1630, Boston. And then eventually, several years later, 1679 is when New Hampshire separated from Massachusetts. But several states that we know today were once part of Massachusetts. So Maine, for example, took a long time to break off from Massachusetts. And these colonies in New England, despite the climate and despite the tough going in the beginning, did end up being much healthier than in Virginia and in the South. Probably because of that Puritan work ethic, and they were not growing cash crops, they were growing food for sustenance. All right, some regional differences in the area. So in New England, this is sort of part of that Puritan legacy that we had going on there, led to some different society. So in New England, they had tightly knit communities, and, you know, people had smaller tracts of land. They lived more in like a condensed town. They went to meetings. Everybody in town went to meeting. Everybody attended religious service. They also relied on the labor of the family unit. So because they have these smaller tracts of land, families are doing the work. So not as much enslaved help in New England. Also, every adult male owned land. So that's an important thing. Everyone, at least had a small amount of land that they lived on and worked for themselves. And because they lived longer lives in New England, we end up having this paternal legacy. So it was heavily patriarchal, really in all of the areas, but because people are living such longer lives there, you start having grandfathers, sometimes great-grandfathers, and all of these men are dominating society, which can become a little stifling for young women, right? And that's part of the reason that the Salem witch trials happened. It was this long, paternal, heavy male legacy that was going on. And then we also have a church-centered life. So New England, everyone went to church. They were monitoring who went to church every week and who didn't. Everyone was very much a part of each other's lives and very much a part of each other's religious life. But in the South, things were quite different. So people lived on large, scattered plantations. So they didn't quite know each other. The nearest person might be miles away. They also had a lot of servants and a lot of enslaved people working their land. So people didn't so much work their own land in the South. And that's part of this as well. So not everyone owned their own land in the South. So even if they weren't enslaved, oftentimes they would live on the land of others and work that land. And then they had shorter lives in the South. Again, not quite as healthy, more disease in the South, more cash crops being grown, different kind of work ethic there. And few churches. And I know today we sort of think of the South as having way more churches than other areas. But in this time period, people lived so far away from one another that it was, difficult to go to church, difficult to even have a church that would serve very many people since people were so scattered. All right, so those are some of the main differences there. The Wampanoags, these were the native people that were near the Puritans up in New England. And the Puritans really were kind of land hungry. So they were taking lots of land. They would offer to purchase it. If that didn't go well, they would force the purchase. They also, as happened throughout the Americas, depopulated the area through disease, which sometimes was accidental, sometimes not, and then regional wars as well, so turning different native groups against each other. The Wampanoags, although they were allied with the colonists, they did fight with other native groups, and often the Puritans, like I said, would turn them against other groups, and it would assist the Puritans in getting more land that way. So forced assimilation, forcing them to accept the culture of Christianity and forcing them to accept their European educational ways as well. So there was some of that, and that continued well into the 20th century. The Puritans did often suspect rebellion amongst the Wampanoags and would preemptively punish them. So one situation in Boston, for example, of some unfair laws and unfair treatment, we had the Wampanoags who were growing cabbage. They had lots of cabbage fields, and the Puritans were raising pigs for meat. And the pigs would go in through the Puritans' cabbage fields and just eat them all. And when the Wampanoags came and said, you can't be doing this to our cabbage, we have nothing left now, there there was nothing that the Puritans would do for them. And so because of that, the Wampanoag was like, okay, well, then we'll start raising pigs and then we'll just kind of assimilate into what you're doing. And so because the Wampanoag started raising pigs, the Puritans said, well, you can't let them graze in the common areas, you can't sell them at market, so good luck with your pig venture. So just trying to really make their life harsh in any way possible. And this all led to a war with the colonists. It's called King Philip's War sometimes, but also King Philip is what they called Metacom. So Metacom was the leader of this native army, and he was the son of the chief of the Wampanoags. And he marched on different Puritan villages and towns, destroyed over 25 towns. Quite successful campaign. In 1676, when they got near Boston, was also when they started running out of food and ammunition. The Puritans ended up killing Metacom. They sent his head as a trophy to Boston. They sent his hands as a trophy to Plymouth. And the morale of the native groups really kind of fell apart. And then the Puritans really crushingly defeated them as well. But destroying 25 towns, pretty good run. Okay, so we have New York and New Jersey, which at first this area was under Dutch control, but it was abandoned in 1654 and became under the control of England. The Dutch West India Company had gone bankrupt. They were doing some corrupt business. And so in 1664, Charles II, who is the son of Charles I, granted his brother James the land of New York and New Jersey. And the Dutch who were there were like, yeah, whatever, we don't care, we don't want it anymore. So that's how it came to be New York, because he was the Duke of York. In New York, there was a lot of diversity, which ended up being kind of troublesome at first for James. All manner of ethnic groups were there, all manner of religions were there, and it was sort of hard to have control over all these different peoples. Eventually, James allowed for this elected assembly in 1683, but there were no like basic voting rights or anything like that, just an elected assembly. A few years later, James gave part of his land of New York, 5 million acres of it, to his buddies, and this ended up being New Jersey. And these guys guaranteed anyone who wanted to live there land, religious freedom, and representation, and then in exchange they would pay him a yearly fee, just like paying rent to live there. They kind of got tired of that, divided Jersey into 2 different parts, and then sold them off to Quaker investors, which Puritans weren't too fond of. They didn't like that idea. The Quakers also changed their minds. They wanted to have Pennsylvania, which looked like it was being in the works. So the Quakers sold it off as well. So no one wants to live in New Jersey. So eventually the 2 Jerseys were reunited into the New Jersey we know today. So that was 1702. All right, Pennsylvania. So we'll get to this. So Pennsylvania was given to William Penn, who was the leader of the Quakers, and it was given to him by Charles II. And this was probably as a repayment because William Penn had been quite loyal to Charles I during the Civil War, which again, that was Charles II's father. And so Pennsylvania was made up of mostly Quakers at first. A bunch of Quakers moved into Pennsylvania when that opened up for them. And things to know about Quakers: very egalitarian, so they thought that everybody had this inner light within them, so anyone could speak at a religious meeting, including women. Oh my gosh. They were also pacifists, so they did not want to go to war. They didn't even have a militia or any sort of military protection in Pennsylvania, and they just relied on peace to deal with the native groups. Half of the people who moved into Pennsylvania were indentured servants, and they brought a lot of skills with them. So they started growing wheat, especially, and they were quite healthy, like in New England. So this was the 2nd largest English migration to the colonies after New England. That was the largest. They did get a Charter of Rights in 1701, and then slowly over time, more and more non-Quakers started moving in. Some people who were Quakers started changing their moral views, and eventually the native population in that area did lose some rights and ended up being pushed out. Alright, we're going to have to do a part 4, so stay tuned.